Hello, Internet. This is a mini lecture from Casper titled How to Read a Comic Book. I know that a bunch of you are reading Watchmen or Sin City for your personal projects, so I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page with what a comic book is and does. Welcome. First thing is that I'm going to be referencing this book, Reading Comics, How Graphic Novels Work and What They Mean by Douglas Wolk. I added a selection to D2L that you're welcome to peruse if you'd rather read than listen to me talk to you. And then you can come back if you have questions. First thing I want you guys to get is that comic books are not text. First thing to keep in mind about comics is that we read them differently than we read traditional literature. When you read a sentence, you control how fast you read it, except for right now, obviously. You pay attention to certain signposts like capital letters, commas, and periods. These give you a sense of how to read, but you're still the one reading it. You have complete control over how fast you read, whether that means stopping in the middle of a sentence or not. But you can still only move in one direction, left to right. Okay, obviously that was really annoying. It's much easier to have static text where you control your own pace. That's the other thing you need to know about reading text. You don't add words together like a Lego until you have a sentence. Your brain does something more complicated. Once you reach the end of a sentence, your brain goes back to the beginning to assemble meaning. So you're reading from capital letter to period and then back to capital letter. That's how your brain constructs a concept out of a bunch of words. Okay, second thing, comic books are not film. Both use pictures to tell a story, but the two use pictures differently. Film shows us a lot of pictures to simulate movement, like this image from this GIF from Buster Keaton. Obviously, that's not what a comic book is. Comics use very few pictures and fill the gaps in ourselves. So this is an old Wonder Woman comic, so pardon the sexism, but what's happened is we're given one static image and then a second static image and yet a third static image, and we're the ones who construct how the three relate to one another. They don't simulate movement at all. They're perfectly still, but we imagine movement when we're reading. Okay, so remember how traditional literature lets us control our own pace? That puts the reader in charge of time in the text. Film doesn't put us in charge of time. It moves at a standard 24 frames per second. Instead, film puts us in charge of space. In the same way that commas and periods help us read literature, zooms, pans, etc., all give us a sense of where to look in order to read film, but ultimately where we look is up to us. That puts us in charge of space. So you're allowed to look at whatever part of the screen you want to look at, and the film can only suggest that you want to be looking at particular kinds. This is how twists and secrets are kept from you by the filmmakers. So what are comic books? If they're not traditional literature and they're not film, they have elements of both of them. They're both of them dealing with time and space. But they're not a hybrid of the two. It's something different because they get more complicated even than this. Most important to keep in mind is instead of restricting how the reader interacts with time or space, when reading a comic, the reader is in charge of both. The reader decides how fast they move, the reader decides where they move to. So here's some basic vocabulary so that we're all on the same page. First up is a panel, which is one of the static images that we talked about. Second is a gutter, which is this blank space between panels. And then third is a tier, which is all of the panels in one row of a page, so from margin to margin. So this is one tier, and there are multiple tiers per page normally. Next up is the speech bubble, which we all kind of know what that is. It's basically pointing to whomever is speaking at the moment, so it's dialogue. And then there's the caption, which is a little more complicated. It could be a narrator speaking, it could be a scenic description, it could be internal monologue. If you're reading Watchmen, Rorschach's journal is written in captions. But you're the one, the reader has to figure out how the caption actually interrelates with the panel that it's inside, whereas the speech bubble kind of dictates itself. Okay, this is a splash page. So a splash page is any really big illustration to draw interest. Usually they start off the beginning of a comic to draw you into the story. So this is the very beginning of this particular issue. But they can also be moments in the middle where Spider-Man is doing some cool jump or whatever. This one also happens to be a spread, which is an image that crosses over multiple pages. Usually just 2, but sometimes it can get 3 or 4 depending on how much money and paper they want to use. Okay, so we're going to start off simply. Comics have to use formal elements to teach the reader how they're supposed to read them. So each page is teaching you how to read it as you're reading it. It's like poetry in that sense. For example, you generally assume that each panel is equivalent to the time it takes to read all the text within it. So you're spending as much time in the panel as it takes you to read all the text in it. So in the first panel, you spend about as much time as it takes for me to say, "After dinner, he took me into my old room. Come, we'll talk while I pedal." And then you move on. That's how it works. So this particular page has 8 panels and 4 tiers. But the layout of the panels also tells you how to read a page. This one is pretty standard, and we can look closer and figure it out. This is how your eyes move around the page. Left, right, down, left, right, down, left, right, down, etc. And that's all fairly simple and easy to go for, just like reading a regular piece of literature. But then something weird happens in the bottom corner. And what's with this round panel? If you read carefully through it, you realize that this represents a flashback. So all the square panels are things happening in the present day in chronological order, and then the round panel is a flashback to Nazi Germany where we get the actual story of the comic. The shape of the panels, or the formal elements of the page, combined with the narrative inside the panels, or the content, allows us to assign meaning to what is essentially just lines. Okay? We're, like every other piece of art, we're working in dialogue between formal elements and content to come up with a meaning behind it. Alright, but things can get weird. So if we give that basic outline, what do we do with something like this? The formal elements get a bit more complex, so how do the layout, tiers, and strange panel shapes add to the meaning? Where do we look first? As English readers and speakers, we're trained to look top left first because that's where the thing starts. But we're also drawn down to this weird stuff that's happening at the bottom. There are gutters here, but there are no gutters here, so we have to figure out how these panels relate. What is the lack of gutters doing? Then there are no borders here, but there are borders everywhere else. So what are the lack of borders doing? And then these panels seem to be overlapping this round one so that they appear to be floating above it in a weird sort of spatial thing happening here. And then finally, this is a symmetrical page. The panels are obviously the same on both sides. This is from Alan Moore. If you're reading Watchmen, a handy tip is to look out for symmetry because Alan Moore is obsessed with it. So how does this work exactly? First thing first, we see the whole page all at one time. That means that strange panels or borders draw our attention even before we start to read. That's why we had to look down before we even got to the top left. Okay, so we see the whole thing. Then we go to the top left and start examining the text and the details. That means we have to move through both time and space, relying on layouts, gutters, even occasionally arrows in order to navigate the page. So we'll start off with the top left, go to the middle panel of the first tier, go to the far right panel of the first tier, then we go down to the next second tier. Then we have a problem though. We start looking, we're not quite sure where we're supposed to be going because we can either go into the round one or we can follow this little bridgy bit of caption into the other pointy one on the right. Remember how your brain has to return to the beginning of a sentence to make meaning? A similar thing happens here. We had to look between these two panels, the round one and the pointy one on the right, to understand how the spatial relationship tells us the temporal one. If you look at the content of the panels closely enough, you realize that the werewolf is attacking the man in both of them, and you're seeing the same moment through two different perspectives, which means that this round panel and this pointy panel are happening at the same moment, which means we move from one panel into two panels, which is something that only could be accomplished in a comic book. It's not something that a film or a novel could actually manage to do. Now that's an extreme case maybe, but the same thing happens in the gutter. Every time you move into a gutter, you have to make that same sort of decision. The way the top and the bottom of the page interact is not a natural or obvious thing. It's a convention that you've learned. You're the one who decides how it works. So 99% of the time we're all going to agree. The top tier moves across the gutter into the bottom tier so that the top tier happens before the bottom tier. But as I say, sometimes it's going to be more complicated than that. Sometimes the interpretation might be very different depending. Alright, lastly let's look at some of the cool stuff that's happening here in this weird page. So the symmetry that we noticed earlier plays out in multiple places. Look how these hands reflect one another, and so do these. So Swamp Thing and the werewolf's hands reflect each other across panels, and then so do the werewolf's hands repeat themselves. These two figures are given equal weight, so Swamp Thing on the left, werewolf on the right are given equal weight in the panels. And then the Swamp Thing on the left and the werewolf on the right are given equal weight across the tier. And then check out how violent the layout is as a whole. Obviously, as a fight scene, the content of it's going to be pretty violent, but the layout itself is also pretty violent. Swamp Thing gets thrown from the top right here to this panel over here, and that's because that's the way your eyes move across the page. You reading help throw him into the wall. So you're moving through space, and you're also moving Swamp Thing through space, which is pretty cool. And then second, look at the way the panels are attacking this man alongside the werewolf. So the points of the panels are going straight into his eyes, which we're drawn to because we're drawn to human eyes, but we're also drawn because all the things are pointing in this direction. So we're kind of being held culpable for the violence against the Swamp Thing and violence against this man. So we are the way this page is working is kind of forcing us to be on the side of the werewolf. Okay, so the gist of what's happening. Comic books are not text or film. Comic books are like both of them, but they're not a hybrid of the two. They're a totally different art form. But they're still, like all art forms, using formal elements to tell a story. The comic book formal elements include panels, gutters, tiers, splashes, spreads, speech bubbles, and they all happen in a particular layout that tells a story. And the content and formal elements interact to make meaning happen. Okay, so here's my works cited page. Douglas Wolk down at the bottom. If I've done this correctly, you should be able to annotate and comment on this if you have any questions. I'll come back and answer anything, or you can just send me an email. That's fine too. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later.